Okay, thank you for showing up today and being interested in my unknownness. And today I'm going to try to present on what I call transcendental pluralism. So it's a little bit based on Kant's transcendental philosophy and the idea that the developmental trajectory is similar to the idea of lines. It does not unfold unilateral, but it self-splits into different streams that parallel each other, but simultaneously show different types and kinds of complexity, and in a certain realm of stages, different types of dialectical thinking. And therefore I try to guide you through the main stages of my model, both theoretical and by application through assessment. So we will look at examples at each stage and how I would distinguish where I put the utterances of people, and from the distinctions applied to their sentences, move towards the description of the stage, which is basically a reiteration of what shows up in textuality, or vice versa. Textuality is a reiteration or reflection of how the internal is structured, so that a current grammatical clause arises from a person speaking or writing, a response to reality. And I did prepare some PowerPoint slides, which I'm now going to share. And it will somewhat relate to embodiment. So as I heard, embodiment is of interest. So you might slightly see the chakras on top. So that's the first slide. You see chakras, and you see a triangle. Triangle symbolizes dialectics, and the chakras symbolize transcendence or transcendental structures, which means structures which are behind consciousness, but structure simultaneously everything that is arising within. To be able to follow through the presentation and understand the examples, it's of importance to know what a sentence is or what a clause is. So you might go back into 5th grade of school, where you did analyze most probably sentences in a very simple way, distinguishing subjects, predicates, and objects. And if you are close to developmental psychology, I guess that's always part of applying assessments. So first, a sentence is always some sort of unity. So it is a distinct part that utters a certain meaning into the world or has a certain content. And there are simple sentences like they listen to the presentation, where you have only a subject, the say, the actor, the listened, the actor acts out, so the predicate, and a certain object towards which the action of the actor is directed, so the presentation. You normally need these 3 parts to have a sentence. But of course, you can generate complex clauses or complex sentences from a simple clause by simply combining 2 sentences, either by using conjunctions like and, or causality like then, or using something else which shows up within your language abilities. Then each sentence can further be modified. So listened is the past tense of listening or listen. So it's a modification of what's the Grundform, the basic undeclinated form of the verb. And these I already explained. What a subject is: the actor, the predicate listen, and the object, the presentation towards which the action is directed. So if you keep in mind that a sentence is a unity, that you can combine unities, that each unity starts with a subject and ends with an object and includes a predicate verb, then everything within the presentation will be comprehensible. And then you already basically can apply my method. So it's on the one hand very simple, but on the other hand it takes still quite some time to apply it correctly. So in the West, when we think of pluralism, we have some sort of eternal struggle that started within ancient Greek or even earlier. The battle between Plato and Aristotle, the battle between ascending to the idea of the good or descending towards the senses. And here we have a clause from Aristotle, from the Nicomachean Ethics, where he says, if then there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this. So you have one clause that's already a complex clause, and then the complex clause is connected with a second clause through an and if. We do not choose everything for the sake of something else. Clearly, this must be the good and the chief good. So what you see is a complex clause that is a combination of two complex clauses. The first complex clause including 3 subjects, and the second clause including 2 subjects. And by being structured this way, it's building a trinity. The trinity with in mind is focusing towards the sensual world, combining what is good on the outside with an idea of the good in the inside that is made up by one's mind. The basic ability you have to have is to count all turquoise subjects. So simply to see that this clause included 5 subjects. The first subject is there, combined with a predicate, is some end of the things we do. So our things are directed to something. Then you have the next subject, which is relating to the things we do, which we desire for its own sake. So the things we do, we desire for something else. You again have subject, predicate, and object. So things are for their own sake. And then you have a new subject. Everything is subject, combined with a predicate, the desired, and you have again a new object for the sake of this. This is as being an object. And then it goes on this way. We as subject have a predicate, which means do not choose with an object everything for the sake of something else. And then this new subject must be predicate, the good and the chief good as object. That's basically the central meaning of what I wanted to convey. And when you now look at Plato, now do you agree with this view of it? Or do you consider that knowledge is a noble and beautiful thing which is able to control man? So you have one clause including 3 subjects and predicates. You as the first subject then agree as predicate with this view of it as the object? Or do you, so you again subject, consider predicate that knowledge is a noble and beautiful thing as the object of the subject you who considers something which is able to control man? So it's relating back to the knowledge, and whoever learns what is good and what is evil will never be swayed by anything to act contrary to the knowledge, but reasonable insight is sufficient succor for mankind. So all I want to show is, and that, or simply believe me, that Aristotle uses 5 subjects and Plato uses 6 subjects. And now the question is it a stage difference, a difference in complexity because one uses 5 subjects, the other 6 subjects? Or is it a difference that's completely contingent? So it could be different. Plato could use 7 predicates and 7 subjects, and Aristotle could use 8 for whatever reasons they choose to use 5 or 6. Or is there something underlying that is creating a typological difference between both, that is forcing them to use 6 subjects versus 5 subjects? And I guess the whole thing becomes more interesting when one looks into the East, where you have 2 Buddhist traditions, which oftentimes are considered as distinct stages on the trajectory of human development. The Mahayana Buddhism as being more evolved than the Theravada, where again, so you have Theravada utterance, Mahayana utterance from the great Prajnaparamita Sutra, which is very similar to Aristotelian thinking. It's about a middle way, about balancing emptiness and form, whereas Aristotle was about balancing virtues and vices. So, or the last, and there you have a clause including 5 subjects. And on the other hand, if you look into Theravada, you again will find sentences that include 6 subjects. And so it could already make oneself wonder, why is the tradition using more subjects within one sentence considered to be less complex or to be less evolved than the tradition that is including less subjects? Yeah, no, normally. So that's of course one thing I'm aware of. So, and therefore we will later continue with texts I myself translated from German into English, so that I could be sure that it's this way. But Sanskrit, since it's an Indo-European, Indo-German, whatever language, it has basically the same structure as German and English, because they all evolved out of Indo-German and Indo-European languages. So they all have the same roots. The difficulty is rather with Greek, because Greeks didn't have interpunctuation or punctuation marks. So if you read different translations of Aristotle and Plato, you might find different ways sentences are structured, because the people later on, when punctuation arose throughout the Christian church father times, they did simply created the way they thought it's best. But of course, I looked through several translations, English, German, original Greek text with punctuation when I look at Plato. And then it's not only that you have textuality. So if you spend time with development, you know development is not only assessed by grammatical complexity, but too by meaning making or objects that show up within the things people verb or verbalize voice. And so there is kind of figuring out where it is not only based on the structure, but too based on the content. And then I looked at both things fit together when I use these. But of course, that's always a difficulty, and I try to consider it by then later on using examples from German that I translated myself, or looked whether the English translations correlate with the German's original text. So the transcendental media, so what Kant wrote in the 18th century, is the still little attempted dissection of the faculty of understanding itself in order to explore the possibility of concepts a priori by searching for them in the mind alone as the birthplace, and analyze its pure use in general, is something that was not often attempted, and for this is the peculiar business of a transcendental philosophy. So a transcendental philosophy looks at the structures which are behind everything that is arising within your mind or awareness. And the transcendentals, or the transcendental media, as I put it, are the structures which allow certain ideas in our awareness to arise without being themselves concepts that are from or within our awareness, but can be recognized when we either look at ourselves or when we look at textuality or other people, how they show up. And the way we are going to look at these media is their embodied form of being chakras, or certain layers within a person that then can be looked at within human development as well. And it's not important to know what they are, how they are named. We will simply follow through them by naming them first, second, third, fourth, and then in the following I will always point towards what's included within the first, second, third, fourth, and so on. So the only thing that here is that I consider these chakras as base structures within the body, from which then development iterates out into consciousness and thoughts, perceptions, and utterances. The other thing, the way I try to explain, or in this way call it pluralism, is the idea of an inside and outside view. So both Carol Gilligan and Mary Field Belenky speak in their works. I hope you know them. Carol Gilligan is part of the moral development line or school of Kohlberg, who showed that women and men develop across slightly different trajectories in the sense of including different objects of importance. And Merrifield Belenky looked at another model built by a man in the 60s that looked at intellectual development of students and created her woman's version of it. And say distinguished between two types of knowing, the one being connected knowing, or which I would like to call inside view, because it's not as much detached as a separate knowledge that is rather separating from world and trying to put everything in categories, but is rather connected to things and trying to feel and see how all things interplay and interact. Someone else who made a similar distinction is Ken Wilber, in the sense of calling that each part of reality as an inside and an outside view. You can look through it detached through a structuralist perspective and putting boundaries around anything, or we can rather look at it from an embodied sense of phenomenology. And funnily, or accidentally, or as a transcendental source for these different perspectives, the human brain or the genes make our brain unfold in a way that it creates within each brain area a kind of fold where the upper part relates upwards into evolutionary newer brain circuits, and one that rather connects downwards into evolutionary older brain circuits. And in neuroscience, the upper part is mostly described as being cognitive and looking at the world from a separate sense of awareness, whereas the lower part is mostly referred to being more emotional and connected. And so we are now then looking whether the difference between Aristotle and Plato could arise from this distinction between connected and separate knowing, as much as the difference between these brain circuits and the inside and the outside view, which both parallel unfold through the trajectory, both embracing and creating different types of complexity using different numbers of subjects in order to convey what's of importance for them. So I guess that's a little bit confusing, but what we are going to look at is this hard realm, which I call certainness. Certainness means it's beyond the first, the second. So it's the third part of yourself, the hard space. And we are basically looking at the four stages that unfold there. So it's simply a kind of process of a stage development that seems to be within the body. And we can relate to these four stages in different terminologies. One developed by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel is calling each first stage being about being. Being means about phenomena within the world. So a new world is powering into your awareness. You're becoming aware of the phenomena, and so the phenomena have some sort of being. Then you move forward into the next stage, adding an essence. An essence means that you are starting to create dreams about the being. So the being in itself is no longer solid, but you have a dream, and the dream allows you to shape reality in a different way. And then you add this to an idea. So you start to understand that having a dream about reality includes meaning. And so you have to generate something that conveys this meaning, which is an idea. And once you have the idea that is holding the essence and your dream together with the being, you start to enter your absolute, which means a sort of presence or awareness that is then holding together idea, essence, and being. On the other hand, if you're used to Jean Piaget, he describes a similar unfolding of stages, in the sense that the first stage generates identity. It generates a sort of phenomena that's solid. And then in the next step, it allows a person to create an inversion so that one can see there's a thing. And if there is a thing, there is something this thing is not. So inversion and identity, being and nothingness, are perceived simultaneously. Then if you see there is something and the opposite, you can start to reciprocate both parts, what is and what is not, so that something like community arises. And when you're able to hold reciprocation, which means inversion and identity together, there can happen a qualitative step which generates a structural wholeness, an equilibration of the self with what is reciprocated between what is and what is not. And we will look at each of these terms more closely when we look at the different stages. So basically only to remember that we are moving through 4 stages and 4 layers, most likely. But it basically means if you see the bowls, you have the magenta ball as the first, then you have the yellow ball as second, and then you have the green or teal ball as the third. So the third is that which is beyond the second and the first. And if you would look at Hegel, the third is an idea. It is seen that someone is creating a dream about being, about reality, and so you're starting to generate meaning.
Okay.
So you
and the reciprocation on the other side.
And the reciprocation on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Or what else? If you have peers, it's mediation. If you have an appearance and the reaction to the appearance, in the middle you have mediation, which is the third. So you see something, you mediate, and then you generate a response back. So there's something third in between. Or the synthesis, if you have thesis and antithesis, you have synthesis as the third, which basically means identity is thesis, inversion is negation, reciprocation is synthesis, or equilibration. Then becoming absolute, self-aware synthesis, absolute spirit. And of course, development starts in childhood. Childhood then starts as a firstness, meaning that is that which is such as it is positively and regardless of anything else. So there is only one thing, one phenomenon, one identity. There is no one who negates it, so no one who can reflect on it. There is no one who has an essence, no one who is dreaming about it. So there is only a phenomenon, like the little child completely fused with the exterior world. And so firstness ends with Piaget's stage 6. And there you can, in children, see either they relate to the world through a monoreme, as Heinz Werner calls it, a single word, which, for example, means there is this animal with legs and tail and head and ears, which is barking, and you call it dog. So you're downloading this adult dream word and put this cognitive structure onto reality, which is an outside view. You're doing something that you could not possibly invent, but you structure everything that's on the outside into this single being. You force this being of dog on the phenomenal realm. On the other hand, other children, less children in our today's world, act completely different. They don't start with naming it a dog, but they mimic the sounds of the dog. They say bow wow or something in German, wow wow. So they are starting to bark. They are not relating to the thing through an abstraction, but they are going into relationship with it, becoming it through imitating its appearance within the sensual realm. So they're becoming identical. They are not generating the being, the dog, but they are generating identity fusion through imitation. And then the sensory realms comes in at ascends versus a descending word that is grasping reality. And two, you can see the difference. The one is a first, it's a single word, whereas the other first is built up out of 4 syllables. Syllable in the meaning what a little child can perform at the first stage of their development, where they can say bo or they can say wo, but they cannot say bo wo. They can only make one of these utterances, which are not adult syllables, but which are infancy syllables. So then we jump into the realm of later stages of development, basically Piaget's 1A to 3b, so pre-operation to formal operation, which we then simply call second because there is something second added. And as Piaget and Inhill write in The Growth of Logical Thinking from Childhood to Adolescence, if one wants to show a correlation, one must first establish two classes of individuals. So basically you have to have a being that's confronted with its essence, with the dream about being, or you have identity and inversion, the thing that is and another thing that's not the thing that is. And then you get secondness, you get something completely new, a new type of development. And there we can again jump at the last stage of that. We can then look at the dialectical stages, where we take a quote from Donald Trump, The Art of the Deal, where he writes, "You can't be imaginative or entrepreneurial." So that's the first part of the sentence. Then it's becoming a complex clause because you have a conjunction in the middle, a causal conjunctum, the if you've got too much structure. So it's basically what we call a proverb. If you look at the Old Testament, the Book of Wisdom, you have all these proverbs which are built out of two simple clauses. If you create a hole for someone else, you will fall inside yourself, or something like that. It's basically a proverb. It's metaphorical, hypothetical thinking that starts to arise with formal operations. And here you can see Trump performing this in his late 30s or so. And you can see that you have two subjects. You have the yellow subject, which is a secondness subject. It deals with essence. He writes, you can't be imaginative. So he's thinking about his dreaming. He's expressing that he's a self which is able to dream. And then he's expressing a second subject. You've got too much structure. So structure is nothing about dreams, but it's something within reality. It's maybe you have a calendar that's too full, or you have your door open, or you have your telephone ringing all the time. So all these structures that are within the sensual realm. So he's basically combining the dream realm and the being realm through a formal operation, creating a hypothesis that is expressing who he is. Now on the other side, you can look at texts within the Old Testament or the Odyssey, Iliad, and the Gilgamesh epic, which are completely differently in their structure, but two are called formal operational. They are so-called narrative equilibrations, where you can see you have, again, a subject. The land could not bear, so the land is not able to serve someone for them, which is the object. And then you have a second clause, to stay together. But to stay together has no subject. It needs the object before them to have a subject, to have meaning. To stay together has some meaning, but they stay together is a complex or a normal clause conveying meaning. And then it's combined with a for, which again is, so to say, an if. If then their possession had grown so large that they could not stay together. So what you have here is, again, you have 4 parts instead of 2 parts. However, now the 4 parts, including 2 subjects, no longer only the bow wow, which is one sensory subject, but now you have basically 2 subjects. On the one hand, their possessions, which have grown so large, and on the other hand, the land could not bear for them. So maybe the first one is more of the sensual, and the later one is more of the inversion. But what you can see is too that the land could not bear because their possessions had grown so large, where you can see the one thing is identity and the other thing is the opposite of it. So both things don't fit together. If you have too much, the land cannot carry for you because you have too much. So inversion and identity are combined within a formal operation. So then what you again have in the hypothesis, you have the second, your essence connecting with the sensory realm. So you have this descending direction of Aristotelianism. Whereas if you have the other thing, so it's basically first moving downward and then it's ascending again. So you're connecting your second to a first, and then from the first, from what it does with the first, you again move up into your secondness. So it's a little bit more complex. seemingly, but it's arising at the same stage, and you already can see maybe the difference. The one thing only relates to things that are really visceral, which you can more touch and see, whereas the other thing is much more abstract. It's creating a hypothesis. And it seems that the difference between this internal complexity between hypothesis or seeing things as connected and being much more related to the concreteness of stuff creates this kind of difference in how much words people can utter. But we will see how this unfolds. So I hope you are getting it so far. So it's still quite simple. So it builds up. And now we move at the third. So passages in this dialectical thinking and adult development, you can see him in the background somewhat slightly to engage your mind and image recognition capabilities. Dialectical thinking describes a more epistemological, powerful way of making sense of the world than the structure of formal operations. And what basically makes it more powerful is the third. So you have a third pole arising, the third pole can see first and second, so it becomes really powerful. It can say, oh, this is meaningful that I have a dream about something that is, or you can say, okay, there is something that is, and I can act in different ways, so let me choose how I engage with the inversion and the identity in reality. Often the third then is called soul or intellect, reason. Yeah, it has, choice is not really right. It's awareness of choice, basically second choice. So if you can, but I'm sometimes not too careful with my words, but basically the second is already choice. Or if you look at Peirce, the second becomes the agent who is making up dreams. So it basically choosing, but it's not self-aware choice. So then you really become, like if you have stage 10 within Lectica's system, there are people become aware that they can choose, which then feeds forward into continuing your awareness and seeing how your context influence your ability to consciously work on your second, so that certain firstnesses arise, certain phenomena within the world. So that's basically it. Or in the sense of Keegan or Kohlberg, you have a third, which is an ideology which is creating itself beyond the formal equilibration or beyond the golden rule. So you become consciously creating an ideology that is equilibrating a golden rule. So for you choose within the golden rule, there am I, there's the other, I try to equilibrate, but then you step beyond and become conscious and create a conscious system that is guiding the equilibration. And so now we are still looking at Aristotle, but on the next slide we then switch, because then I guess it's more important to stay with accurate assessments and accurate knowledge of how sentences were structured by the authors, and not deal with these contingencies of translation and punctuation, which happen throughout history. So you have Aristotle, who writes, from these supreme things, something stated cannot be proven. So there are certain supreme things which we can call ideas, or which is the substance that which can never change, which is awareness. And one can only base it on opinion, what these supreme things are. They can be stated, while they can be stated as parts of others. So you have opinion as something that's streaming. So people make different opinions, different dreams about reality, but they can be stated as parts of others. So they can be stated about something that's visible within reality. But what you have is a third subject, the supreme thing, something that is arising within your mind. So the only thing that happened is that a third is put on top of this kind of hypothetical proverbial structure that you could see in Trump's writing. Now, when you look on the opposite side and you look at Plato's Lysis, where he writes about the love between a man and a man, come then and let me hear all that you give these to hear. So you see again, you have come then and let me hear. The subject has come then and then let me hear with the object. Then give these to hear has again no subject. It needs the object as subject. So the object of the earlier clause is subject. Though that I may see whether you also know how it behooves. So you see again, I may see whether you also is the object, then know how it behooves has no subject. It needs the end of the earlier clause to be meaningful. A lover to speak about his beloved to himself and also to others, where you have a subject arising, the subject now in the end, the sentence ascends into the new subject, which is the lover with certain emotions, who is starting to reciprocate with the other. So you have come then and let me hear, or that you give these to hear, which is some sort of identity. I may see whether you also know how it behooves. So then I recognize that you not only have this identity, but are more than only this identity. So you have an inversion. And then the inversion and identity are reciprocated in the idea of a lover who is able to speak with a beloved in a way so that both start to fuse. So you have not this Aristotelian idea of some supreme, which is in being of an idea, or in Kant's terms, a substance which is eternal, which you can speak about, which you can only experience as your soul. Single loop learning, so you are aware of your hypothesis that you are creating about reality. Whereas on the other side, you have this kind of process that feeds upwards into your heart space and creates there then a sort of ideology that is able to guide accidents. So accidents, all the things that arise and pass away, everything that you are able to equilibrate through the narrations you tell about reality. So you have this dichotomy between being up in your substance versus being still downward in the earlier realm and looking upwards into the substance, which is all the beautiful things that you could express through an ideology, while you are identified with all these things that ever change, your abilities and so on. And now we shift simply to the conflict, how it proceeded within the 18th, 19th century. So Kant in the 18th and then Hegel a little bit later in the 19th, very interestingly, that Plato too lived earlier than Aristotle, so the inside view came before the outside view in the same way as here in the 18th century, the inside view with Kant came before the outside view with Hegel. But I'm not sure if it's generally the way. It's the same with Buddhism, where the inside view was Theravada is earlier than the Mahayana. And so here again, it's starting to get complicated, sadly. So here you start to somewhat enter into, I guess it's already Kegan stage 5, or Kohlberg stage 5, constructor in terms of ego development. So that's basically the last stage today's models can measure, so to say, where it is said by Hegel, religious motives have acquired such a human aspect and have so perfectly adapted themselves to our feelings that, led by our hearts and lured on by the beauteous images of our fancy, we readily forget that cool reason disapproves of such images, or indeed even forbids so much as comment on this sort of thing. So you can simply see the subjects that I demarcated. And on the other hand, you could grasp the meaning. So the person is thinking about the mind, how it relates to religion, about kind of being deceived by the nature of religion, which means the person is dealing with their mind and is reflecting on the earlier mind, the substance, which can be changed by certain impressions from the outside, like religion. And then you can look at Kant's first book. So again, you see the kind of funny subject structure. You see there are, for whatever reason, he's using 6 subjects. Prejudice covers all the rest with the appearance of perfect equality and does not let one become aware of the difference that still prevails among them, and which would otherwise expose him to the distressing observation of seeing how often one is still surpassed by those who are still within mediocrity. So what you see here is you have a different subject structure, but what they basically do is the same. Hegel talks about how one is deceived by religion, how one generates things that are contrary to one's reason when one is infused by the feelings religions can generate in oneself. Whereas Kant, on the other hand, writes that we have prejudices, and our prejudices make us vulnerable towards not seeing that other people are smart, brilliant, have certain capacities, and then leads to some adverse outcomes. So both are thinking about their thinking, are aware of their awareness, but also in very different ways given their subject structure. So the Aristotelian view then, even so in Hegel it was expressed a little bit different, is that you basically have one part of yourself that is substituting the senses. So the senses drop away, you suddenly live absolutely within a trinity of your mind, and this trinity of your mind is either balanced by mind and life, so your awareness or your soul interacting with your dreams, or vice versa, the trinity is trying to align your substance, your ideals with your dreams, which basically is the definition of double loop learning, where you are an aware cause of aligning organizational success and changing strategies. So the strategies as the mental and the success in the outside world as the life dream aspect. So success is always a dream, success is nothing real, it's what you make up. And you are creating this alignment between inside and outside, or in the Mahayana sense, between emptiness and form, by the trinity of your awareness, which is substituting your senses and makes you detached from the sensory realm, putting you basically within your dream space, so that you become a new essence of a new being. You are the essence, the dreams that your reason can make up about your being, which is aligning with reality. On the other hand, if you have an inside view, you see again inversion and identity conjoining. When you go back to Kant, the first sentence says that you have prejudices, and the second sentence says, if you have this identity of prejudice, then you will create these adverse outcomes, like you're becoming blind to the brilliance of others, and this will kick your ass in the end. So that's basically what happens here. Identity and inversion are calibrated, but implicitly. So you see there is nothing beyond these two certainnesses, these two trinities. So you're always either identity or inversion, you cannot move beyond. So the dialectics is very implicit, like in Plato's writing, where you are argument and counter-argument, and you move back and forth between argument and counter-argument, you never step out. But by moving back and forth between inversion and identity, you suddenly come up with an enlightened idea, connect to the good, and suddenly you receive the truth. Whereas on the other side, you can see there is a sort of conscious dialectics. You have your awareness of awareness that is trying to balance these two poles, your strategies and reality, your emptiness and your form, your vices and your virtues. So it's getting even more complicated. Hegel 5 years later in 1800. So you can see a new structure. I simply read it and try to trust me that I dissect it right and don't invent subjects where no ones are. So he writes, this religion, so one wherein eternal and relative are unified from the absolute or by the abilities of an absolute, can be sublime and terribly sublime, but not beautifully human. And so the bliss in which the eye has everything opposed under its feet is an appearance of time, basically equivalent to that of depending on an absolutely alien being which cannot become man. Or if it had become this, that is in time would also remain in this union, an absolutely special, only an absolute one, the most worthy, noblest, if the union with time were ignoble and base. So you have a very complex clause. What the complex clause has is a subject in the beginning. Then it talks about the bliss in which the eye has everything opposed under its feet, an appearance of time, so as some sort of essence, some dream that is made up about reality, and then it had become something, so it become something sensory, something within firstness. So you have a third, the subject, the totality, then you have a second, the essence, your dreams, and then you have again some sort of senses. And so the inside view is always less surprising because it simply adds and adds the same structure on top of each other. So that's Immanuel Kant when he speaks about dreams of a spirit seer. He writes, I have to change something about these images here, but it's here. The philosophical doctrine of spirit seeing can be accomplished, but in a negative sense, in that it establishes the limits of our insight with certainty and convinces us that the various phenomena of life and nature and their laws are all that we are privileged to know, whereas the principle of this life, the spiritual nature which we do not know but assume, can never be thought of positively because no data for it can be found in all our sensations. And therefore we must make do with negations in order to think something so distinct from everything sensual, where even the possibility of such negation is based neither on experience nor on conclusions, but on a fiction to which a reason stripped of all auxiliary means resorts. So you basically have 3 parts. The first part, simplified, says deals with the abilities of reason. So it's an identity. The second part deals with the inversion, your ability to do something unreasonable, namely connect towards spirit. So you have identity, reason, inversion, connecting to spirit. And then you have a third where the inversion, which means you can do something with spirit, is connected to reason in the sense that reason in the beginning can make sure that one proceeds in the right ways and does not talk things one cannot talk. But when it comes to this negation, all these negations can never be justified by reason. So both inversion and negation show up within the third clause as being reciprocated within the mind of the person who is trying to move towards the divine by using the via negativa. So saying, the divine is not my body, the divine is not my thoughts, the divine is not my dreams, the divine is whatever it is. So then you get an outside view. You have an idea. The idea is guiding your dreams, and the dreams are unifying with a being. And you have some sort of triple loop learning because you are trying to align your essence and your being with the third, your idea of totality. So a certain source of meaning. And on the other hand, you have a reciprocation that is trying to bring identity and inversion together, in the same way as Piaget thought about the concrete operational stage. So you see, then you suddenly have some more conscious dialectics because you have a third beyond your second and first, and a new mode of dialectics arises, which means that a transcendental source, so the ability to connect with spirit, and despite the inability of reason, is starting to reciprocate your reasonability, is making negation and distinctions, and your inversion of reason, namely your spiritual sense of being. And so that's already almost the last slide, where it's again getting more complicated. So, and we don't necessarily have to read it, but I guess one can. But both worlds grasped by the spirit which goes into itself from this loss of itself by the concept are confused and revolutionized by the insight and its spreading. So you have something like the spirit, the first, that's now coming up as a spirit, and the spirit is holding an idea, the enlightenment or a totality, but this only shows up as a single word or as a fractured sentence within the larger whole. That then is adding the realm, which is distributed and spread out into this world, and the other world returns to the self-consciousness, which now grasps itself in morality. So you have a second dream and essence, which is the moral part of yourself, which is within spirit. And then it moves out the entity and the being as the real self. So the real self, what appears within the sensual realm, the being no longer puts its world and its reason out of itself, but lets everything glow in itself and is as conscience, the spirit, certain of itself. So the thing that's in the beginning, the spirit in the inside, is becoming the spirit on the outside through this degenerate idea of enlightenment. And then the dream about reality. Then there is subject, there comes something active, like an essence, which goes into it from this loss of itself by the concept. So you have something active or confused and revolutionized by the inside and its spreadings. And you normally have something with senses like inside, or you will read something like here you have, which now grasps itself in morality. You have, now that's the third, the realm. You have the realm returns to self-consciousness. So the realm is something outside, but it's then of course somewhat an interpretation what these terms really mean. But oftentimes it's very obvious that the sentence which are marked yellow deal with dreams or with action ideas, and the sentence marked magenta have something like sensual realm or vision or imagination or something included that is directly related to something sensual, even if the sensual is mentalized, like it's something, a mental sensory impression and not a really external. And if you look at the sentence of Kant, you see that it suddenly has 4 parts, which can remind back to the bow wow and the formal equilibration, where he writes, thus moral laws together with their principles are not only essentially different under all practical knowledge from everything else in which there is anything empirical, but all moral philosophy rests entirely on the pure part. And applied to man, it does not borrow the least from knowledge of him, but gives him as rational being laws a priori, so the transcendental stuff, which of course still require judgment sharpened by experience. So where you see you're moving into the second, it's now about judgment and stuff, partly in order to distinguish in which cases they have the application. So you have the inversion, the distinction, the negation, and then partly to give them entrance into the will of man and emphasis for their exercise. So entrance into something which is on the outside, basically, which is not you, which is an identity, which you can only enter to move through the sensual realm. And then the latter, as himself afflicted with so many inclinations, is capable of the idea of a practical pure reason, but is not so easily able to make it effective in its way of life in concreto. So what you have here, you don't have this kind of spirit, this universal category, or the word dog, which is absolute spirit. But what you then have is something that's very connected to reality. He comes up with a certain means to an end, a moral philosophy, which you can start to think things through and come to conclusions how to behave in complex networks of relationships. And so you have an outside view, which is adding an absolute being towards the totality, combining essence and being, whereas on the other side, you get again an equilibration where you add a means towards an end, a means like the moral ability, the practical reason, which is guiding then the reciprocation between identity and inversion, so that completed mental realm arises. And so how can one tell that this is basically both the same trajectory? So this means if it has a starting point and an end point, you have to have something very distinct beyond it to really say that both end at the same point, and it's not simply a mistake. And Hegel, some more years, I guess 13 years later than 1800, he suddenly writes that instead of a triplicity, the abstract form may also be taken to be quadruplicate. So he suddenly has the idea that there isn't only synthesis, antithesis and thesis, but there is something for us, something which is additional to dialectics. So we're suddenly moving into a new realm. And how can you see this? It's very strange, because complexity completely drops and Hegel no longer produces this very complex Trinitarian clauses, but suddenly produces quadruplicate clauses. Like, since truth contains all determinateness in itself, and its essence is to return to itself by its self-determination as much as it has different forms, and the business of philosophy is to recognize itself in these. So you have a sentence that starts with a wholeness, then the wholeness ends within the subject, so everything is combined within this one thing, which is spirit. And you will not find very in any more complex clauses within the science of logic, whereas before you kind of, with Kant it's a little bit more different. I switched to Georg Simmel, so he's a successor of Kant, and when he approached this point in his life, he holds 16 lectures on Kant. So I guess Kant was there too, but he was at the same time very old, and when people get old, they too start to drop complexity, and dissecting their writing becomes more complicated because seemingly their thoughts are more often interrupted and things become much more fragmented. So I choose Simmel because he's on the rest of the trajectory completely identical to Kant in the sense of structure, but not in the sense of what he produces in terms of thoughts. You see, it's a little bit more complex, but not too much more complex. The greatest philosophers say, according to the factual sense, so you have sense as the first subject, you have sense, that of the multiple contents of experience, which in mere experience always appears fragments. So fragments, you have inversion, the yellow part, a difference. One is felt so strongly in such immediate connection with the roots of life. So with the roots of life is something that might be seen as a reciprocal source, where both are combined, the senses and the fragments. And then you have a force that it claims to be the source of meaning of the whole. So it's, again, more than the roots, it's the whole in itself. And then you have certain terms. And you basically have two in both sentences for subjects, but the difference that one can see is, if you further dissect it, one can see in the inside view in the same way as the inside view at the first stage of certainty produced kind of 5 parts, because you had these 2 parts of 2 parts and 1 part beyond where you have a fifth. The inside view in each sentence tries, or almost in each sentence uses 5 parts. Something claims to be the source and meaning of the whole. So you have a kind of staircase, whereas on the other side, Hegel tends towards using only 4 parts within his subclauses. The truth, so the absolute, which contains stuff, so the absolute contains ideas, basically, or determinateness, the essence, or the goal orientation, your dreams that cause stuff in itself, as then the reality that's feeding back into the truth. And so you get 2 different types of thinking. Again, the one already more substance, again, in the sense of that you always have a unity of the difference between certainty and firstness. So you have certainty as the mental, then you have difference as your essence, your dreams, and below you have the first. So unity of the difference between certainty and firstness is basically of Niklas Luhmann, who says that everything is the unity of the difference between system and environment. And all these thinkers there come up with very similar notions about something being the unity of the difference of 2 things. Whereas the other side is more concerned about being meaning itself, being this instrument, this means to an end, which shows up within a 4th stage as well. And this means then is trying to reciprocate identity and inversion, mostly by building a community of the heart. And since you have some fifths, one could speculate that similar to state praxis, where you have a turia theta, the one which is beyond the 4th, which is the 5th, in which the entire universe appears as a self, one could assume that one day people discover the pattern iterating even further into a 5th as the culmination point of human development. So this was basically the presentation. I have one more slide, which is simply so showing the new Human Research and Development Institute where I'm part of. So we look into adult development, and we try to validate my model. So I have a student who is trying to score, and we start to approach some correlation, even if it would not be good enough, I guess, at the moment to really publish something. And we have never statistically looked at it. But at least we're having, for example, this longitudinal study where we started in 2019 or 20. And here you can see 2 students, which I did assess last week because our program ended. And then where you can see how they developed from 2020 to 2022. And you don't see too much development, just like a quarter. So here, from here up to there, and they were quite the same. And back then we did a quantitative EEG study with Loretta, and that's quasi the brain of a construct of a person. It shows the red areas are where it shows overall more resting state gamma brain activity, which was more in the left hemisphere, which might indicate that the second half of the stage is more left hemispheric than right hemispheric. But that's, and we are now doing new EEGs. We are collecting the 3rd series of EEGs and then starting to correlate again to see whether things turned out. And of course, we are looking at these differences. Why are 2 people?
EEGs?
EEGs, electroencephalography of the brain, where you have
right, I get it.
electrodes. And it's a procedure that back projects into the brain so that you have images like MRI.
I know.
But I'm not doing this. And of course, we look how these differences arise when people do the same program, but why do some develop and others stay? Here, basically, the upper person had a breakup within a relationship. So that's the only basic difference within this 1 year of having the same training that then might account for this person moving forward, whereas the other person staying who she were. So that's part of the research we're doing and validation, what I wanted to include. Thank you for listening. So